We're going to answer two questions about the Samaritans before we talk about how Jesus eased tensions with them. The first question is this, follow along on your outline. Who are the Samaritans? Okay, who are the Samaritans? And to answer this question, we have to travel back as far as the division of Israel into northern and southern kingdoms before they were exiled. We're going back a ways here, but we have to go back as far as the division of northern and southern kingdoms to understand where they came from. After the reign of Solomon, Israel divided into two kingdoms. And if you're taking note here, and you want to jot this down, jot down 1 Kings 11 and 12, 1 Kings chapters 11 and 12, and 2 Chronicles chapter 10, because this will tell you where this stuff kind of went down at. But Israel divided into two kingdoms after the reign of Solomon. There was the southern kingdom, which consisted of Judah and Benjamin, and those continued to be ruled by descendants of David. And then there was the northern kingdom, which consisted of the other 10 tribes of Israel. And this kingdom was ruled by various kings and short-lived dynasties that were not of the Davidic line. And though the southern kingdom was far from perfect, the northern kingdom was much worse, and they were idolatrous from the very start, and they never had really a good period in their existence. And the northern kingdom alternated between bad and worse until it was finally conquered by Assyria and carried off into captivity in 722 BC. Jot down 2 Kings 17 if you want to check this out. That's where that's at. But at the time that the northern kingdom was carried off, people from other lands were brought in to settle that territory. And when they began settling and living there, it says in 2 Kings 17 that lions were attacking the people, and they began to sense that there was a problem, and they called out to the king of Assyria and they said, we are not worshiping the God of this land. They're polytheistic, and so there was gods of this land and gods of that land. They says, we need to worship the God of this land. We're not doing so. That's why there's lions attacking us. And so they called and asked for the king of Assyria to send a priest to show them how to worship the God of that land. Well, it was the God of Israel, the true and living God. They didn't realize that, though. And so a priest was sent back, taught them how to worship the Lord. And so the end result was that there was a nation of Jews and Gentiles kind of intermingled together, and that there was Jewish worship as well intermingled with pagan worship happening in that northern area. And those people that were intermingled, worshiping in an intermingled way, became the Samaritans. Do you follow me? In other words, the Samaritans are what became of the northern kingdom after it was conquered and carried off by Assyria. And the Jews in our text, on the other hand, are the descendants of the southern kingdom. They were also defeated and carried off into captivity about 150 years after the northern kingdom was. But unlike the northern kingdom, they managed to maintain their Israelite identity and their worship uncorrupted. And eventually, they were allowed to return to Jerusalem and Judea about 70 years after they were carried captive. And jot down Ezra and Nehemiah, those books, if you want to go back and check it out there, because that's where it records that. But that's who the Samaritans are. They're what's left over after the northern kingdom was carried away. That's what became of it all. The second question is this: why was there rivalry between the Jews and the Samaritans? Why was there tension there? There were two main reasons. First, there were theological differences between them. It would appear that over the centuries, the worship of the Lord became predominant in Samaria. Remember how I told you there was pagan worship and all kinds of stuff happening there, and the worship of the Lord was just kind of inserted into all that. We don't know how it all unfolded, but somehow over time, the worship of the Lord became predominant in Samaria. They became monotheistic, and they worshipped only Him, and there wasn't pagan worship happening there anymore. However, their worship of God differed from the Jews in some pretty significant ways. Most notable of these was the fact that the Samaritans only accepted the Pentateuch. And do you know what I mean by the Pentateuch? I'm talking about the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Those are the only books that they accepted as God-inspired scripture. They rejected the historical books like the Samuels and the Kings and the Chronicles, and they rejected the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah. They basically rejected everything but Genesis through Deuteronomy. And you may be asking yourself, why would they do that? It's because all the rest of those books emphasized the priority of Jerusalem, and they emphasized the priority of the Davidic lineage of the Messiah. They didn't have either one of those things. And so it made them feel delegitimized, and they didn't like that. And so they didn't pay attention to those books. They were only interested in the first 5. Also, the Samaritans had their own holy site, their own temple. For the Jews, again, it was Jerusalem, and rightly so. For the Samaritans, it was a place called Mount Gerizim. And this is what the Samaritan woman was talking about in verse 20 in the text that we just read when she said this: "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, yet you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one must worship." Do you notice what she's bringing up? That you have your temple, we have ours, you have your mountain, we have ours. And she's bringing up the theological differences that were already in place at that time. There were huge differences between the Jews and the Samaritans. They both worshiped the same God, but they went about it very differently. And they both thought that each other was wrong. Okay? They both thought each other was wrong. This is actually similar to the relationship that we, if you want to conceptualize this today, it's similar to the relationship that we might have with a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon, okay? Most of us have had the experience of a Jehovah's Witness knocking on our door with their altered copy of the Bible and their Watchtower magazines in their hand. And they claim to be Christians. And when they do, how do we respond? We say, well, no, you're not, right? We do. Most of the time. And the same thing happens when the Mormons, when they knock on the door and they have their Bible and they have their Book of Mormon there and they claim to be Christians. Oftentimes we'll say, well, no, you're not. You're not a Christian. That's pretty common for us. Are they worshiping and praying to Jesus? Yeah, they are. But their idea of what that looks like is very different from us. And we would argue that these differences go as far as to delegitimize them in terms of Christianity. We don't really regard them as Christians. And they, when you really get down to it, they say the same thing about us. We're both worshiping the same person, the same God, but we go about it differently, and both of us are saying that each other is wrong. So the theological differences between the Jews and the Samaritans were a lot like that. Both of them worshiped the God of Israel. Neither thought the other was legitimate. And it's at least worth mentioning at this point, in verse 22, that Jesus affirmed the Jewish position, just to be clear about that. So I'm going to give you verse 22 right now. Jesus said, you Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, because salvation is from the Jews. And so I just want to be clear. I'll come back to this later. But Jesus is saying, yeah, our position is the right one. Okay? No ambiguity there. There's another reason why there was tension, though. The second reason is that there was acts of violence and injustice between them. Acts of violence and injustice. There were more than matters of theology. I just unpacked those. But there was more than that dividing the Jews and the Samaritans at this point. By the time of this text, both sides had taken physical action to harm each other. In Ezra chapter 4 through 5, we see that it was the Samaritans who attempted to stop the Jews from rebuilding their temple when they were allowed to return. Most of you have probably read through that account at some point, and you know about the obstruction that there was from the Jews building their temple. It was the Samaritans who did it. It was the Samaritans. We also know that the Samaritans were a big part of the obstruction in Nehemiah for the Jews rebuilding the wall. And we also know that historically that the Samaritans sympathized and helped Greece in their conquest of Judea under Alexander the Great. So as Judea, the southern kingdom, that area that's the southern kingdom now, was being conquered by Greece, Samaria was housing their troops and helping them. So there's some real grievances there. But on the other side, on the flip side, after the Jews won back some independence from Greece, they attacked Samaria, they destroyed many of their cities, and they burnt their temple on Mount Gerizim to the ground. It happened about 128 BC. And so my point here is that both sides of the coin, by the time that the text was written that we just read through, both sides could point to some very real atrocities that were committed by each other. And again, sticking to this locked horns analogy, it's possible for these cycles of conflict to become a tangled mess. It's possible to become so mired in conflict that both sides are swinging, both sides are taking shots, and it's hard to tell who's really at fault. It's hard to tell who started it anymore. All you see is just fighting, and you don't even know what's going on, who's right, who's wrong anymore. You just see hair flying, and it's just hard to even make sense of it. Perhaps the best example today of this is seen in the tension between the Jews and, if we were to have a comparison of the Jews and the Samaritans in that day, you might look to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today. Again, both sides have a theological argument, but in addition, both sides have violence or claims of violence against each other, and it keeps things locked up in attack mode, and they can't seem to break the cycle. They can't seem to unlock their horns. The Jews and the Samaritans were in a very similar situation. They were locked in a cycle of unending conflict, fueled by centuries of theological differences and actual exchanges of violence and injustice. So for the Jews of that day, being a Samaritan was on par with being demon-possessed. I'm going to show you John chapter 8, verse 48. The Jews are speaking to Jesus. They're speaking of him. The Jews answered and said to him, "Do we not say rightly that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" They're putting down Jesus. They're saying, "You're demon-possessed and you're a Samaritan." Kind of synonymous. That's what the Jews thought of Samaritans at that time. And understanding this dynamic helps us to better picture the shock that Jesus' Jewish audience would have experienced in response to the parable of the Good Samaritan. Probably one of the more famous parables Jesus gave, the Good Samaritan. In that day, there was no such thing among the Jews as a Good Samaritan. That wasn't the way that they thought of it. And so it would have been shocking for them to hear. And just to be clear, on the Samaritan side, for the Samaritans' part, there was no love lost on the Jews either. The Samaritans hated the Jews just as much. It was reciprocal. They both hated each other. And why am I telling you all this? Because this is the level of tension that Jesus stepped into when he entered Samaria in our text. This is what he successfully ratcheted down. This is the example of the horns that he helped to unlock. It was a real tangled mess.